China versus Vietnam. The 1979 border war? War does not always begin with a declaration. Sometimes it begins in silence, with troops moving in darkness, artillery positioned along invisible lines, and political decisions made far from the battlefield. In February 1979, while much of the world was focused elsewhere, two communist nations turned their weapons on each other. This was not a clash of ideology versus ideology. This was power versus pride, strategy versus survival. This was the China-Vietnam border war, airs at dawn on February 17, 1979. More than 200,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army crossed into northern Vietnam along a 600-kilometer front. There were no dramatic warnings, no global countdown. Just movement, fast, deliberate, and violent. China called it a punitive operation. Vietnam called it an invasion. History would remember it as one of the most intense but least discussed wars of the Cold War era. Historical alliances and betrayals. To understand how this war erupted, we must go back decades, to alliances forged in revolution and betrayals born from ambition. China and Vietnam, from allies to rivals after the Second World War, Asia was reshaped by decolonization and communism. In 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. Just years later, Vietnam began its long struggle against French colonial rule. China became one of Vietnam's earliest and strongest supporters, supplying weapons, training, and political backing. During the Vietnam War against the United States, Chinese advisors, engineers, and air defense units quietly assisted Hanoi. Rising tensions. The Cambodia factor. In 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge regime. While the Khmer Rouge was responsible for mass genocide, it was also China's closest regional ally. Vietnam's action shattered China's strategic influence in Southeast Asia and expanded Soviet-aligned power directly on China's southern flank. Preparing for punishment. To Beijing, this was unacceptable. Chinese leadership believed Vietnam had grown arrogant after defeating the United States. They believed Hanoi needed to be taught a lesson, and so plans were drawn not for occupation but for punishment. A short, sharp war designed to demonstrate China's strength, expose Vietnam's weaknesses, and send a warning to the Soviet Union. Launching the attack. By early 1979, Chinese forces were mobilized. Artillery units rolled into position. Infantry divisions trained for mountain and jungle warfare. The decision had been made. Northern Vietnamese border towns were struck simultaneously. Chinese forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming local defenses. Roads were destroyed. Villages were evacuated. The war had begun. Vietnam's response. And as the smoke rose over the border hills, Vietnam prepared to respond not with panic, but with experience earned through decades of relentless war. Vietnam's military doctrine. Vietnam had been at war for more than 30 years. Against France. Against the United States. Against internal insurgencies. By 1979, its military doctrine was built on endurance, flexibility, and total resistance. While much of Vietnam's main army was deployed in Cambodia, northern Vietnam was far from defenseless. Terrain advantage. As Chinese troops pushed deeper across the border, they encountered terrain that favored the defender. Steep mountains, narrow valleys, dense forests, and poor infrastructure slowed mechanized movement. Vietnamese forces avoided large, open battles. Instead, they fought in small units, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and close-quarters combat. Unexpected resistance. Chinese commanders had expected resistance. What they had not expected was its intensity. Urban fighting erupted in border cities like Lang Son and Cao Bang. Artillery pounded defensive positions. Infantry assaults were launched repeatedly, often at high cost. The People's Liberation Army relied heavily on manpower rather than modern combined arms tactics. Vietnamese defensive strategy. Vietnamese units used pre-prepared defensive lines, underground bunkers, and concealed firing positions. Even when forced to retreat, they inflicted heavy casualties. Supply lines were harassed constantly, roads were mined. Communication lines were disrupted. Casualties and human cost. The war became brutal and personal. Casualties mounted on both sides. Exact numbers remain disputed, but estimates suggest tens of thousands were killed or wounded within weeks. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Civilians fled in all directions, caught between advancing forces and retreating defenders. China's withdrawal. Despite initial gains, Chinese forces struggled to achieve decisive breakthroughs. Vietnamese resistance slowed the advance, forcing China to commit more troops and resources than anticipated. By early March 1979, China announced that its objectives had been achieved. Chinese forces began a planned withdrawal, destroying infrastructure and military facilities as they pulled back. Low-intensity conflict, although major combat ended in March 1979, peace did not follow. Instead, the China-Vietnam border entered a decade-long period of tension, skirmishes, and low-intensity warfare. Artillery duels became routine. Patrol clashes flared unpredictably. Entire border regions were militarized. Regional and military impacts. Vietnam fortified its northern defenses, diverting resources from rebuilding its war-torn economy. China modernized its military, drawing hard lessons from the conflict. Lessons about outdated tactics, poor coordination, and the cost of underestimating a battle-hardened opponent. Diplomatic repercussions. Vietnam became more deeply aligned with the Soviet Union, relying on its support for security and economic aid. China, meanwhile, accelerated its opening to the West, particularly the United States, positioning itself as a counterbalance to Soviet expansion. Long-term lessons for China. The war also changed how modern China viewed warfare. The leadership recognized that sheer numbers were no longer enough. Modernization became a priority. Technology, training, and doctrine would define future conflicts. Vietnam's national resilience. For Vietnam, the war reinforced a national identity built on resistance. Once again, the country had faced a stronger power and survived. Yet the cost was immense. Border regions remained devastated. Mines littered the countryside for decades. Families displaced by the war never returned. Military lessons learned. The 1979 China-Vietnam border war was short in duration but long in consequence. It demonstrated that ideology does not prevent war, that alliances shift, and that even limited conflicts can reshape military doctrine and regional balance. China's modernization push for China. The war exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. It became a turning point in the transformation of the People's Liberation Army into a modern fighting force. Vietnam's endurance. For Vietnam, it was proof that resilience, terrain, and experience can blunt even a numerically superior enemy. Global and regional implications. For the world, it was a reminder that some of the most dangerous wars are the ones fought quietly, without headlines, without declarations, and without clear victories. The border today. The border is peaceful. Trade flows where artillery once fired. But beneath the calm lies memory of a war that lasted weeks but echoed for decades. Because history does not forget battles fought in silence. And neither should we.